Welcome to Hitting Home. I'm your host, Megan Driscoll.
And I'm Becky Coletta.
And we are here to break down how decisions in D.C. affect our local communities.
Because all politics are local politics.
Welcome to Hitting Home. Today, Becky and I are going to be doing something a little bit differently, right, Becky?
Yes, we are.
We are going to talk a little bit about ourselves, actually, because we started this podcast and we kind of jumped in head first, which is what we basically do, and then realized that maybe people didn't know us that well. So we thought this would be a good opportunity that if you're interested in learning a little bit about us, that we would do a show on us. So,
and if not, you can skip it.
Exactly, right. If it's really boring, forget it all. I do get lots of questions about my background and things like that, so hopefully people will find this interesting. But I thought we should start with you. So maybe a first good question would be, why are you interested in politics, or how'd you get involved in politics?
So
Becky?
I've watched politics my whole life. I grew up in Louisiana, where politics is sort of a sport, and my dad was involved. I did my first political commercial when I was 5, and I got on TV and said, "Vote for my dad. He's the best." Even I know that.
What did he run for?
Assessor, which was a big job down in New Orleans.
There was TV spots?
TV spots. It was a big job.
Wow. I guess
Parish-wide assessor was a big job.
Okay.
He didn't win.
Right.
And so I've always been interested in politics. And when I was in school, I was on the school paper, and we covered a lot of politics. Then when I was in law school, I did a lot of political work in law school. We did organize buses down to D.C. for Women's March around reproductive rights back in the late 1980s, worked on the Review of Law and Social Change, and did a lot of work with battered women. And so sort of politics was always what I was interested in. But then I sort of had a professional career that was very driven around business, and I only followed national politics, right?
Yeah.
And then met my husband and moved to Hanson, and we said, okay, this is where we're going to raise our family.
Yeah.
And we started to get involved. We had friends who were involved. I ran for town office. And once you start to develop the skill set and the knowledge set for town government, you start to understand town budgets, went to trainings.
It is a little like addictive.
It kind of pulls you in.
It kind of pulls you in. That's so true.
So then I got more involved in local and regional politics and helping people I care about and that I like do local and regional politics.
Yeah, that's great. Yeah.
How about you?
Yeah. So I don't, it's funny. I was like the president of my class in high school, which I think is a version of politics. But I don't know that I actually made a connection really, truly to that. I was a history major, so I was sort of interested in the sort of, I was an American history major. So I did really like enjoy like learning about why we're all here and kind of what we're doing and fundamentally how things work. But I would say I was not interested in politics at all. Had a very long career in business, and for the majority of my life, actually did not feel like I could speak politically because
of business reasons.
Yeah, we had like over 200 employees, and I never wanted to make anybody at my office feel badly about who they voted for or whatever. So I would say it's only in the last maybe 10 years that I started paying a little bit more attention to national politics. I got very involved with wage equity because I saw inequities in my business life. I was in recruiting, and so I owned a recruiting company, and I was seeing inequities, and so that got me really involved in the political process and filed a bill, filed legislation, and then worked to get that passed. Actually, and it was passed this past summer. But I would say up until that point, I was kind of a little bit standoffish for many years. So it's interesting that now that I am no longer the CEO of a company, I've been able to sort of gloves are off, and I can like kind of talk about stuff and share my opinions.
And not feel so hamstrung.
Yeah, exactly.
But what about local politics? What made you interested in local politics?
Yeah, I think I got involved with we have a local rep, Josh Cutler. I got involved in his campaign a couple of years ago. Yeah. So that's actually where we met. Exactly. Yeah. And I think that was the first time I really thought about like the representation really matters. And it was through working on my wage equity legislation that actually then introduced me to sort of the local political scene and why it's so important to be involved. And where I would say, committed to this idea that all politics are local politics, right? So I think that's ultimately how I kind of got involved. Talk a little bit about your business background.
Well, no, it is kind of interesting, right? Because we both spent years in the business world
Yeah.
where we weren't as involved in politics. For me, it was less time. I went to law school and went to work at a big firm in New York that was a corporate firm. And after that, I left that firm to join a communications company. That was kind of always my first love. And I think when I look at politics, a lot of it is with that communications lens. And I went to work for a satellite communications company during a period that we were actually trying to break up an international monopoly of governmental systems. So international satellites were all government controlled starting in the 1960s, all the way until our system was the first international private system in the 1990s. We launched in '89, but really it sort of isn't during the 90s.
Look at where it is now.
Yeah, it was. But, honestly, it's funny because some of the people I worked with at this company went on to work for SpaceX because,
Yeah.
some of the same people who are working in satellite launches and they say that my old boss reminds them, sometimes Elon reminds him a little bit of my old boss, but I think my old boss had a lot more. He was somebody who always liked a company that was under 100 people because he could know everyone, every secretary, every marketing person, every executive. He knew you personally.
Yeah.
And that's very different than an Elon model.
Yeah.
But he was crazy, and we had a complete, there was a boycott against us that was signed by 135 nation members. To boycott us as a private satellite system. So it was kind of an interesting time in the 90s where we went to a lot of different countries to develop marketing agreements with local carriers and get our services into all of these countries and work with a lot of television stations. So it was kind of the, other than the fact that Senator Markey at the time was a congressman who helped to pass the privatization of the satellite industry, it was a more non-political time in my life, but it was a lot about how the international systems work.
Yeah.
It was interesting.
Yeah, sounds interesting. So
everyone's really interested in you, Megan, because you developed your own business and grew it into a big business, a fairly big business.
A very big business,
So can you tell us a little bit about that?
Yeah. So I started as a recruiter out of college, and I decided that this is so me, that I could do it better. That certainly they weren't doing it the right way, and I had a better way.
We've noticed this a little bit.
Exactly. And so I decided to start my own company and incorporate some of the things that I loved about the way recruiting was done at my old firm, but incorporate things that I knew needed to change. And so started my company. The short story of it is that it grew exponentially, actually, through some real changes to the model and the way in which we sort of innovated away from a traditional recruiting model. And we blew up, and we had offices in Switzerland, office here in Boston, obviously, had about 250 employees. I ended up selling it to a private equity firm. I stepped down as the CEO in 2020, maintained ownership through 2022, and completely am out of it now and not even on the board or anything. I sort of am cheering it on from the sidelines, but it continues to grow and do really well. And it was a lot of...
Was it mostly biopharm? Like when we talk about biopharm, did you get to know that world a lot?
Yeah, of course. Yeah, that was the only, we focused exclusively in the pharmaceutical industry, but we worked on roles that were from, entry-level research associates all the way through to like a C-suite position within a pharmaceutical business. And the reason why we had office in Switzerland is because we had contracts with organizations that were basically out of
European.
Basel. Exactly. That's actually a funny thing when I think about the kind of things that you do when you're like the CEO of a growing business. I took my family to go to Switzerland to set up the office for the summer, and we were there for 6 weeks, and I did 45 business development meetings in 5 weeks in 5 countries.
Yeah.
And I on top of this, I also planned all of the events for my family. So like they'd be at the Eiffel Tower and I'd be at meetings in Paris. They'd be at the Munich Zoo and I would be at meetings in Munich. It was just...
I just don't know how you did it, honestly.
Well, I also did it without any air conditioning. And I have to tell you, that's really hard to do. So what I would do is I would plan a full hour ahead of my meeting time to show up at a grocery store because they didn't have residential air conditioning in Switzerland. So I would organize myself so I could get to a grocery store, and I would be able to stick my head in the
So you
freezer
wouldn't
section.
look all sweaty.
Correct. There were several meetings actually where I would show up and I would be like, trying to be
But
super
they all
professional.
looked and smelled sweaty
They
anyway.
weren't. No, they don't. No, they don't.
Oh,
no,
I
weren't.
thought they did.
Nope. They were all they were wearing sweaters. It was like 100
Oh, I know, in
degrees.
suits, and they.
Yep. And I literally have beads of sweat like dripping on. Like, don't mind me. Don't mind me. Yeah. So that's kind of a
But
funny
I don't
little.
know how you did it with kids, because for me, I was in that period of doing a lot of international travel when I didn't have kids, and I couldn't imagine having done that with kids, because
Yeah, it was
I can
hard.
remember one summer I was going to like India and Taiwan and down to South America and then back up to the US and then back over to Europe. I don't know, I couldn't have done that with
Well,
kids.
eventually eventually my husband decided to stay home. So we kind of switched roles when my son, I think my kids were maybe like 9 and 5, maybe, or no, maybe a little bit older. I'm trying to remember exactly. Yeah, I think it was like around 9 and 5 is when my husband started staying home, just because the travel and the schedule was just so intense. But what was interesting about when I stepped down, so at the time I stepped down in 2020, I think my son was maybe in 5th grade, and I remember I had put him on the bus like 3 times in his whole life at that point.
Right.
And so I was actually really excited to step down and be able to spend time with them, because I was seeing the writing on the wall with my daughter who was going into high school, and I was feeling like, oh, I really want to be connected with her before she goes to college. And then 2020 happened, and I was like, well,
A lot of
I didn't
time.
think I was going to get this much time. But it actually worked out great, because if you ask what's interesting about it is I felt very not present, right? Not present at all.
For your daughter.
For either of them, really, when they were younger. I mean, I went to all the things. I always, if I'd go to a board meeting, I would literally get on a plane, fly to the board meeting, and then I would go to the board meeting in LA, and then I would get on the flight and take the red eye back. So I would really only be gone for like one full day. Like I always organized my travel as
To
best
be home with your kids as
minimally,
much as you could.
as much as I could. So I made lots of games, all that kind of stuff. But I will say that because of the timing of it, my kids actually like don't really remember that I wasn't
Right.
there, because COVID was like this, like we got to like really hang out. We
Right.
really did.
Yeah, I
but
loved COVID
But
for
I have
that
to say
reason.
that that's one of the reasons.
Sorry.
When I think about, I did too for those
It's hard.
reasons. For
It was hard.
It was hard, but for those reasons, I do too. But I think that that's one of the things that or impetuses for me to get involved was being home all of a sudden. It was like, oh.
Right.
I started paying attention to more of what was happening in our community than I had previously.
Well, and both of us had jobs that allowed us to be home. So in that sense, we were kind of lucky,
Yeah.
because you had just left your company,
Yeah.
and I was at that point doing legal work from home.
Yeah.
And I could, I would occasionally have to go meet with people to do a closing.
Right.
But I could do that from home. So in that sense, I was lucky that we could kind of hunker down in a way that, a lot of our friends are nurses or firefighters, and
Yeah.
they couldn't do that.
Right.
So obviously it was different for us than it was for them.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
Yeah. And so you have one child?
I have one son, and it kind of defines my life a little bit, because I went through 5 years of infertility treatment. So when we talk about reproductive rights,
Yeah.
it brings a lot of those issues home to me.
Yeah.
Having gone through miscarriages, and when I read about what's happening in places like Texas, and
Well, it's
fear that
personal to
could
you.
happen nationally. I know what it was like when I needed those services,
Yeah.
and I can't even imagine someone at that point in my life questioning my need for those services when
Right.
you're going through loss.
Yeah.
So, so 5 years of infertility in my 30s really kind of does have a big impact on how I view the world and how I view some of these issues.
Yeah.
And then I was grateful and lucky to have my son when I was 42.
Yeah.
So I'm an older mom.
I don't know. I think that's more normal. It would probably, in our era, it was.
I'm still on the older side.
Yeah. I don't have that many friends who had children after 40, but I would say that's much more common today.
Yeah.
Than it was when you were 40, you know? what I mean?
Yeah. So it's so yeah, that's a big thing. And I think I also am a little different from you in that I grew up in Louisiana.
Right.
And so I grew up in a very different environment with, going every Sunday we went to the family farm. My grandparents had a farm. And when we're talking in Louisiana, our farms aren't necessarily as nice as the farms up here.
It's like a farm.
It's like a farm where people worked hard.
Yeah.
So we would go to the family farm every weekend, and
Like where slaughter happens.
no, it was vegetable farm.
Okay, all right, that's
Vegetable
fine.
farm. It wasn't
It can't
that bad.
be that dirty. No. Okay, I'm thinking.
It was just, my mother grew up in real poverty.
Yeah.
And my dad grew up in poverty in a city, which was different because he was food insecure. My mother was never food insecure.
Right.
So he, in some ways, is more scarred by his childhood poverty than my mother is.
Yeah.
And I think that also influences me because I always grew up knowing that it took one disaster for people to end up in a very different place.
Yeah. Well, I think that's the problem too, which is that we're sort of headed. We've come to this place where we have government working for us because of we've created safety nets for people so that
Right.
they aren't one catastrophe away from being bankrupt, right? And now we're in a situation nationally where we're tearing those things down. We're going backward. We really are going backwards to a time where you will become just one disaster away from losing everything that you've worked for.
Oh my God, I look at this idea of getting rid of income taxes and going back to tariffs. That's like 1910. My parents were born in 35 and 36.
This is a time when people didn't graduate from high school, never mind graduate from 8th grade.
My grandfather
Working
went
on
to
a railroad.
third grade.
Yeah.
My other grandfather left school when he was 12.
Yeah.
My
Mine-
grandmother
mine as well.
got through 8th grade. That was a big deal.
Yeah.
Because they needed to
She's
work.
highly educated.
Back then, my grandfather.
Well, in Florida, just to talk about your group.
Oh, they just said that they're going to let 14-year-olds
Start
do
to-
overnight work.
Yeah.
So these issues really kind of hit home for me because
Yeah,
of the way I
absolutely.
grew up.
Yeah.
We grew up, my dad had his own business that he developed in part because of the skills he got in the Navy.
Mm-hmm.
And that was his way, really, the skills that he got in the Navy helped him to get from poverty to the middle class.
Yeah.
And at different points in his life do quite well for himself. But it was a hard journey for him, and he's never let me forget that. And that's why education and school and having me work so hard to get through school, get to law school, be able to go to NYU Law, those were really big. I think he is more proud of me than I am of myself.
Yeah.
Because I was able to do something it just was outside of the realm of what was possible for him back then.
Well, I also think that we have privilege too. We've benefited from the privilege of our forefathers, of our skin color, of
The GI Bill that helped
the
him
GI Bill,
get some education.
Yeah. The fact that we both have parents that stayed together, married for very
Yes,
long.
which
yeah.
reduces poverty.
Right, stability, so
Yeah.
we come from a sort of from that perspective too, which I think shapes a little bit of the way we
Right.
think about things, and I see it as a way of, I see it, I think some people who grew up in that environment they discount how important those things are, whereas I see them as reasons for my success,
Right.
whereas
Right.
the luck of the draw to be born to the parents that I had at the time that I was, with the skin color that I have, with the environment that was offered to me, I see that as like a little bit of lucky,
Yeah, and I've never felt like that took away from my sense of I worked hard, right?
Yeah.
I'm kind of a little burned out now, people. But, I was the kid who did everything, who had to get good grades,
Yeah.
who really put my all into the newspaper in college, into the journal in law school, and into my work. I worked a gazillion hours at the law firm in New York City, literally like 3,500 hours a year. So I don't discount the fact that I worked hard.
Yeah.
But I also don't discount my privilege.
Yeah, that's right.
They were both.
Yeah.
It's both and.
Yeah, it is both and.
And how about you? Like, you grew up in Duxbury.
I
That
grew up in
seems like such
Duxbury.
a
I'm like a
different
local
experience.
girl. Yeah, I'm a local girl. Well, my parents didn't really have any money. They bought a house in Duxbury, and I remember like my mom saying they had to eat like ramen noodles for like a year to afford it. We didn't ever went on vacation because our vacation was the Duxbury Beach, and we should be very grateful for that. So I spent every day on Duxbury Beach with my mom. Luckily, did not have to work growing up, and that was the sacrifices that they made to be able to live in Duxbury, and to be able to allow us to go to the school system. And so I'm very much a product of Duxbury High School, the Duxbury school systems. And my dad was an engineer. He went and got his college degree. My mom did not graduate from college. My dad did not graduate from college until he was 40. So he went back to school. He had an associate's degree and went back to his bachelor's degree. So education was really important to them. The fact that my sister and I both went to four-year colleges was a really big deal. It was something it was not an option.
Right. Not for me either.
There was no, we're not going to college conversation in the family at all. And there was no you're not getting good grades. This was very, I grew up very structured in that way, But it's funny, I didn't really think about my privilege very much until I actually went to school down south and realized, even just the way that they are taught history is very different.
Yeah, it is.
I think it was probably my first or second fraternity party. And this kid from the South said to me, I just want to talk to you about something, you Northerners. He said,
you were still a Northerner.
Yeah, I'm 18. You know that the Civil War was all about economics. And I was like, what do you mean by that? I was really taken aback. And so it occurred to me that, different parts of the country are very different. And so that's when I kind of was like, oh, wow, I've had this really interesting, unique upbringing in a town that is white, Christian. I had a very wholesome kind of upbringing. And it was the first time I was introduced to the fact that not everybody had that, And so that's when I really understood the privilege that I had. That's when I really was like, wow, something I had was really special. And again, it goes to, and we talk about how important local politics are, and it's so critical that we continue to support our local government, because we have opportunities to provide that same experience for our children. And I think we've lost, that's what really I'm most concerned about as we move forward, is we've lost that we are the children kind of, that song that was super popular when we were younger. We really have lost our ability to see that we are giving them a different kind of world than we had, and how do we give them the same experience that we had, this where hope
better
or something better, or even just that hope exists, that that prosperity, that opportunity is equal for everybody. How do we expand that for people?
Well, and when I was growing up, things weren't always easy. I mean, when I was in college, my dad basically was going through a bankruptcy that was tied to outside economic forces. I get what it is like for people to go through that, where all of a sudden you go from things were okay and then interest rates go up to 26%, and the bottom drops out of the oil market in Louisiana, and suddenly you're over leveraged and you're dead in the water.
Yep.
So I've seen that happen too. You build things up to lose them.
Yeah.
So I understand that sense of vulnerability that people have.
Yeah.
So, and I think because we always spend a lot of time with our family, and the family, my aunts and my uncles all took very different paths, and not all of them had it easy, and not all of them made it to success. I also had, a family that dealt with substance abuse issues, and
so many families. I mean, that's
so many
families.
But that was, that was a big piece of my life growing up.
Yeah.
And so, it wasn't so idyllic, and I think I've tried to make sure that my son has something that's a little more stable than I had.
Yeah.
And the other thing is, I grew up in Louisiana, where my three older siblings went through a school system that was better, but by the time my sister was coming along, the school systems were getting defunded after desegregation. And I ended up getting moved into the Catholic school system, not because my parents didn't believe in public education, but because the public education system was being abandoned by people who could afford to go to private schools or Catholic schools.
Yeah.
And so when I see people start talking about things like vouchers, or do we really need those good of a school system, or do we need to put all...
Well, we don't fund our government.
It makes me a little crazy, because I feel like I've seen that disintegration happen down there.
Yeah.
And I've seen what the results are.
Yeah.
And it really is sort of education for fewer and fewer people.
Yeah. Well, it's services for fewer and fewer people. I mean, that's what we're looking at. We're looking at services for fewer and fewer people. We want to remove people from the services that they depend upon, up to and including potentially Social Security and Medicaid and education. And I mean, you name it, everything is on the chopping block. And I think
Social
that's
Security cannot be on the chopping block. Like I look at it and
know,
say,
it's crazy.
I've saved my whole life. My husband saved his whole life. But our retirement doesn't work without Social Security.
Yeah.
And I think we're in better shape than most people at our. I just turned 60, so we're better than most people at age 60.
Yeah.
But it doesn't work without Social
No,
Security.
my mom's life doesn't work without Social Security. I mean, it's just a fact. It doesn't compute. There's no way that her life continues the way, and she's not doing anything other than, basically maintaining her weight, right? She's existence in life, right? There's no fancy trips. There's no trips to Florida. There's no summering anywhere else. There's none of that.
Right.
There's just maintaining her life with her friends and doing like basic things, right?
She has a nice life, but it doesn't work without Social Security.
Yeah, there's no large scale vacations. There's no summers. There's no winters in Florida. Those things are not happening. It does not work without Social Security. So, and I think that's kind of why we started to do this. Ultimately, kind of bringing this home now.
Right.
Why we started Hitting Home was that we felt as though the national political environment have become so toxic, quite frankly, and some of these things that they're talking about doing and then doing are so tragic to and so against everything that we
have experienced, have worked for,
wanted for our children and for others' children, right? That we decided we wanted to do this podcast. So, well, I think, I think that I hope that people have gotten a little bit of a better idea as to kind of like who we are as people, and why we're committed to providing this information. We really ultimately want to talk about topics that are big and complicated and then break them down for people so that they understand how they actually affect us here in Massachusetts, because I think there's an idea that we live in Massachusetts, it's blue, we're protected. But I think everyone knows that you see it online, you see that influence kind of slowly kind of coming in, and maybe even strongly coming in some places. And we really need to push back against that narrative, and we need to provide people with information to help them make good decisions and hopefully get more engaged. Hopefully this podcast engages people to get involved with their local politics, because all politics are local politics. We both really agree with that. And so that's sort of why we're here. Yeah.
Yep.
Yeah. Well, thanks for joining us. We appreciate it. As always, let us know, if you've got any ideas for shows, anything you want us to talk about. We are interested in that. So thanks for coming.